Yu, Benamana, Quaban, Indigenous, Quaban, Anishinaabe, Nosquen, Janine, Mike Dockry, Green Bay, Rochbaya, St. Paul, Chonakenikas and Bilgam, Anishinaabe and Dow, Quaban and Dow, Shishibani, Devin Douglas. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the committee for having me come talk a little bit about the future of forests and working with Indigenous people to sort of envision that future. And as you will see, and what my title says here, partnerships are the key to doing this. So we talk about traditional ecological knowledge. If you don't have partnerships, you're really not going to be able to engage at an appropriate level with Indigenous knowledge. So partnerships for me are basically the foundation for all the work, and we've seen that in the presentations today. So real briefly, I'll talk about tribal forestry in the United States. I kind of changed up my presentation a little bit last night after I had some conversations at the reception, and I thought I should talk about Menominee too, and about the origins of sustainable forest management in the United States, particularly in the concept of how do we envision forests, how do we think about sustainability and move forward with our management. This is really a story that needs to be told. And then I'll briefly just touch on a little bit about some tribal innovations in forest management. And the last part is a bigger section of talking about my research on building partnerships with tribes. So essentially, I want people to leave here with some practical, I guess, practical examples or practical things that you can actually do and try to employ in your own work to build strong partnerships with tribes. So I was talking about community forestry. I like this definition of community forestry, that the goal is to conserve the ecosystem and improve the well-being of communities. Again, we've been talking about this today. The health of the ecosystem and communities link. And for tribal communities, this is codified into law for tribal management on the reservations. It essentially says it has to produce sustainable opportunities for the tribes, as well as protecting the ecosystem. But also, I think, with traditional views of people and forests being one and the same, connected. So I think it's a very useful thing to think about tribal forestry as community forestry. So we've got over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Of these, about 300 of them have forests that they manage, totaling about 18 million acres. And these tribes have managed their forests for all different kinds of goals and objectives for hundreds and hundreds of years, for generations. They've managed these forests through many changes as well. Social changes. We're in Ohio. I'll add a slide here. We'll see in a moment. But tribes like my Potawatomi tribe was removed from Indiana, right, southern part of Lake Michigan. The tribes were removed from these areas, but that's a huge change. So in my reservation, again, I have some maps here, but when we show up in Kansas and Oklahoma, that's a massive ecological change. That's a massive social change. It's a massive economic change, and we've managed these forests and we continue to manage. So we have a lot of practical experience about managing through change. And the other point I always like to make, and I think it's important, is that all these tribes are different. We have different histories, different languages, different understandings about the world. We're also diverse internally, just like all of our populations are, right? Some people think, one way, some people think another way, some people support maybe the government that's in power, some people don't. So there's lots of diversity within. When we talk about traditional knowledge as well, there's different knowledges that different families or clans might have around similar issues, but that knowledge might be different. So there's a lot of diversity. Here's a map of the United States showing federal lands and Indian reservations. So the Indian reservations are the reds, and the other colors are national forests, national parks, the other federal lands. And I like to show this too, particularly from the Forest Service perspective, but I think for all of us who are managing landscapes, you have to have partnerships. to manage this land, right? Here's Wisconsin, where I'm from. Said I was from Green Bay, this area. The Oneida Reservation is here. Menominee, which I will talk about. Have people heard about Menominee? A few. Okay, so keep this sort of reservation shape in your mind as we move forward. But if we're not managing, one, all these lands were tribal lands at one point, right? Period. But if we're not managing, how can we manage this if we're not building partnerships with our tribes? Up here, the Forest County Potawatomi is intermingled in literally a checkerboard with the national forest. And this is true all over. Here's Ohio. We don't have reservations in Ohio. We've got the Wayne National Forest. I saw some other federal lands on one of the other maps, but I didn't see those on this one so much. But again, these lands were tribal lands at one point. If you go to the Forest Service, if you type in Forest Service Tribal Relations, you'll come to the home page. All the way at the bottom of the Tribal Relations Office is essentially an Esri map maker, and you can look at the entire United States and all the treaties. So I pulled this out of that. So the area where we are here was seated in a massive treaty. This all of this, and this in 1795. These are the tribes that signed on to the treaty there that ceded these lands. It's important, I think, to understand where we stand and recognize that these tribes essentially had managed this landscape, again, for generations for many different values. Okay. So this is a room that I don't need to explain too much on this, but forests are managed for cultural activities, for materials, for hunting and fishing, economics, whether you're selling baskets or something else, sacred sites, ceremonies, etc. Now I'm going to kind of switch into my Menominee portion. Here is a map created by the Menominee tribe. This is Lake Michigan. Here's the Bay of Green Bay, so this is Green Bay. And this is essentially their ancestral territory. They're indigenous to Wisconsin. They do not have a migration story. Their stories say they come from this place. And for them, that's been really important, that touchstone of being from this place in order to help them maintain their forests and use that forestry to enhance their own sovereignty. So I put this bullet in. Sustainable forestry started here with the Menominee Nation. Here's the county map of Wisconsin. Again, this cutout, you can see that shape. So the Menominee Nation is about 235,000 acres, most of it's forested. But from 1854, when they signed their first treaty, or signed one of their final treaties, to today, they've been harvesting and milling timber. So, this is kind of an old log run on the reservation. They're hard to see because these pictures are pretty old. Here's some milling, this is more sawmill. And here you have the essentially modern sawmill. They've been cutting trees, forestry, like we think of it in the economic sense today. And so when they've been doing this, they've been able to harvest the equivalent of clear cutting all of that land about 2.5, 3 times. And today they have more volume of higher quality than when they started. This is a picture, and it's the background of the slide, but taken from a fire tower up there on the reservation. So the question really is, how do you define sustainability? How do you think about sustainability? And this is how Menominee people think about sustainability. Here's Google Earth, okay? Can you see that outline? A lot of Menominee people will say, well, that's sustainability. Look at the satellite. Okay, that's one way to think about it, right? Yeah, that's really cool. The other cool thing about this is you see these aerial photos through time. This is Stockbridge Munsee, essentially reservation, another tribe, a New York removed tribe. And you can see this is forested. They were allotted and lost land through the allotment process like many of our tribes did. But they're buying it back and they're reforesting. So this line is not as stark as it was if you looked at an image from the 60s, for example. Up here, this is National Forest. You saw that border. That too is becoming fuzzy. Like, where does that end and where does the other begin? which is really a testament to the management to promote healthy forests across the landscape. So in 1854, this was a treaty medal for that 1854 treaty given to the Menominee tribe by the United States government. This was a typical gift that the government would give, mint coins, and present them with the tribes as they're ceding their land. And Chief Oshkosh was one of the treaty era leaders of the Menominee people. And he defined sustainability and his vision for sustainable harvesting this way, essentially saying that start with the rising sun and work toward the setting sun, but take only the mature trees, the sick trees, and the trees that have fallen. When you reach the end of the reservation, turn and cut from the setting sun to the rising sun, and the trees will last forever. This was before the treaty was signed. This was in that time period. How do we transform? How with the Menominee shrinking down from millions of acres down to essentially 200-some thousand acres? How will they be able to maintain themselves? And this is the vision. Cut, but don't take everything at one fell swoop. Menominee history goes further after, so this is in 1890. I'm going to quiz you on all the things it says in this. But I like it because it kind of looks cool. So this is an 1890 law. This is the first law that's limiting timber harvest in the United States. And this is, I actually do underline, you don't agree, but not exceeding 20 million board feet of timber per year. Amazingly enough, that was 1890. If you go today, that's basically how much they harvest today. They've been doing on average around that every single year since that time. So this is the first law that's limiting. This is before the Forest Service. This is before we had forestry schools. And for the United States government, this was great. This was fitting into the Indian, the way they were treating with Indian tribes. So they're trying to make Indians farmers, right? Assimilation into farming. And so they thought Menominee was a tribe that was kind of far away from everything. They were isolated. They weren't quote unquote assimilated. And so they thought, the government thought, this is really perfect because we can have them slowly clear cut the reservation 20 million board feet at a time. And for the Menominee, this was great too. They thought, this is limiting the harvest. This is how we can get Chief Oshkosh's vision in place. If we cut 20 million board feet per year, we'll be able to do it in such a way that that forest will last forever. And it will produce all the benefits from the economy and keep the forest itself. Probably going to hear some of those early Menominee leaders. Again, you saw those other photos. So a few more things on Menominee Forest history. This is Senator Bob LaFollette, who's governor and senator of Wisconsin, one of the progressive era leaders. And he got a law passed in 1906 that essentially gave money for a sawmill. And following in sort of the progressive mentality, one, science can help us manage, so doing actual forestry is important. And two, resources need to belong to the people. So they were busting railroad unions, et cetera, because, and saying this is United States people should be benefiting from these resources. He was also saying that tribal land should benefit tribes. So in this law, and then there was another amendment to the law, essentially says Menominee have to work here. This is for Menominee. They're the ones that need to work at a sawmill and benefit from it, and they're the ones that are going to benefit from their own resources because they are tribal resources. So here in 1910, they built, using money from that legislation, they built this sawmill. They still got the sawmill in essentially the same place. The technology is a little bit different, but it's, you know, if you think about a lot of those sawmills, what happens in that time period, you build a big sawmill and then, you know, the forest is gone and the sawmill closes, right? This is still there in the same spot. So, point about that is essentially that from the time of the treaty, existing treaty, you know, through time and into today, Menominee have been managing these forests. And they're doing it in such a way that maintains their culture. They have forests on the landscape. They have all the species and the diversity that they need from their forest, that they want from their forest. And they're making money from it enough to supply the community with jobs, healthcare, education, and all the things that we want from community forest management. Here's a nice picture on the Wolf River. Now, just real briefly on this tribal innovations, kind of going faster than I thought, but that's okay. I just talked a little bit about sustainable forest management and how that was really an innovation that the Menominee, in conjunction with the federal government, made to produce that sustainable, outcome. We're seeing right now a lot of tribal empowerment coming. People have probably heard of the DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline protest. There's protests up in Canada. There's a lot of protests around climate change and timber harvesting in the native communities, indigenous communities, really throughout the world. And this is growing. Right? There's a real sense of growing empowerment that the tribes are having. And that's something that's really going to drive future of environmental management. Tribes have also been really saying, in pretty much any venue you can imagine, that we as managers, Forest Service managers, other managers, need to take account for traditional knowledge, indigenous wisdom, when we do our work. And so there's a real need to try to think about how to do that with climate change, with invasive species, etc. And then I just put a quick reference on, we did a special issue of the Journal of Forestry where we have, I think, 30 articles on tribal innovations and tribal management of forests. And I recommend people take a look at it. I think it's all open access too, so you don't have to be a member of Society of American Forest to check it out. So tribes are innovating in all sorts of things. Here's on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. They're doing some fire and fuels management, which is really cool. Bringing that traditional knowledge into how they manage, merging it with their own sort of modern fire management. In many cases, we bring up examples like the White Mountain Apache because the Forest Service would love to do a lot of this on federal land, but we have had a hard time doing that for many reasons. But we hold up the tribal forestry, this tribal fire management, as if we could all do this, it would really help make our forests more resilient to what's to come. Here's on the Menominee Reservation, a pine barrens restoration. This one's really cool. They restored this pine. I have a lot of old photographs that you can see. The spacing of the trees look very similar in these old photographs. But this had all grown up. There's a lot of kind of oak, shrubby kind of stuff coming in. And they cleared it out. They burned it several years, and they were getting things like big blue stem coming back, right? All those prairie grasses in these barrens on the reservation. So really, again, trying to foster diversity and using tribal knowledge in a way that merges with the modern science. Tribes are doing innovation around climate change and invasive species. Here's a picture of a black ash swamp. So unlike the upland ashes, black ash grows in fairly, I think 80–90% of these forests would be ash trees, black ash, very wet soil. The species is extremely important to many of our tribal communities. For example, we make lacrosse sticks out of it, basketry. Some tribes out east have their origin stories coming from the ash, their people come from the ash tree. So it's extremely important culturally. And emerald ash borer, of course, is going to be coming in to take out these, basically kill all those trees. So the question is, what is going to happen? And research shows, and the tribal concern is, when these trees all die, this is going to turn into a swamp, a marsh. That water level is going to come up, and basically what happens is no other tree will grow there because the water will be a lot higher. These trees are pumping the water out. So they've been doing, tribes themselves, independent of maybe working in tandem a little bit or sharing experiences, but some of the tribes I've worked with have started just doing experiments, common garden experiments, in these forests to see what kind of trees could grow here to basically, when the ash die, they're ready. So they're underplanting a whole assortment of trees from the area, some trees that are a little bit further south, and in order to see what could actually take that ecological function, laying climate change on top of it by looking kind of south for other species. flowing from tribal sovereignty. So again, we have a lot of our tribal communities are leading the way in climate change and adaptation because they're not going anywhere. Our reservations are set. They're not going to be able to move. We're not going to be able to just start taking, take up and move to Canada. That's not going to happen. So really tribes are extremely innovative, but they're practical. They want to see things work. Hence, like this common garden experiment in black ash forest. And I think tribal innovation also forms from partnerships. We've seen, I worked with the Menominee for about 10 years, or eight or 9 years. I was at their tribal college. So I got to know how Menominee managed the forest, I got to know Menominee very well. And what you see by meeting people, understanding their community, reading about their history, and learning, is that they've been really astute at forming partnerships along the way in order to help them. For example, that 1890 law that was limiting timber harvesting. That doesn't happen with every community. Menominee were small in that part of Wisconsin, so you have Ojibwe bands kind of to the north, Potawatomi to the south, some other ones to the south, Dakotas out west. So really they were these astute partnership builders. I will also say that oftentimes we think about, I heard the pre-settlement forest in one of the earlier talks. When we think about this area, there were French people there less than 15 years after the Mayflower. Right? So in terms of contact with Europeans, Menominee had hundreds of years before we did our forest surveys in Wisconsin. And essentially we would do those surveys right before we did the treaties for the reservation establishment. So the survey for that part of the state was 1853, I think it was, and then the treaty was 1854. Anyway, so it's flows of partnership. Now I'm going to switch my gear to partnership to finish off. I'll probably finish a little bit early. I always tell people to keep in mind who you're making the partnership with. And there's different levels. Right? I've already mentioned tribal government. So here I just took my tribes. This is our seal. We have an elected government. Every tribe does. They have elected government. That's for the Forest Service, for federal agencies. That's the tribal, the government-to-government relationship. That has to happen. That's required by law. Right? There's that consultation at the government-to-government level. But there's also a lot of intertribal groups. So, for example, in the Great Lakes, we have the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or the Chippewa-Ottawa Treaty Authority in Michigan. These are tribal groups coming together, typically through court cases that happen in the Pacific Northwest as well, that the tribes exerted their treaty rights. The states, might not have agreed that they could fish or hunt, or whatever the treaty right they were exerting, and it goes to court. The court has upheld treaty rights pretty much across the board anytime it comes up. And so these are groups that form from multiple tribes that have signed those treaties. Like I showed you one treaty, an older one, but you saw how many different tribes are on there. So multiple tribes sign the treaties say things, and they reserve rights. These are entities that tribes use now to manage off-reservation treaty rights. So in Wisconsin, that's like the national forests are the biggest sort of non-tribal landholders. So they're working with the Forest Service in order to maintain treaty rights and access to those. So those are intertribal groups. I say that because it's easy when you have 12 tribes in a group to think as a federal agent, okay, we can just meet with them and that's good for the tribal consultation. Well, no, that's not. That's a group that's not the tribal government. It's a tribal entity, but not the tribal government. There are also sort of like, I guess, NGOs, so like the Intertribal Timber Council. Again, this is a group that tribes essentially support. This group to advocate for tribal forest management. We definitely have partnerships with them. Tribal colleges, this is the College of Menominee Nation, Sustainable Development Institute, that's who I partnered with when I was there. So it's really important to understand who you're making partnerships with. And in the back of your mind, remember that tribes are diverse internally as well. a few perspectives. I have 3 perspectives, and then I'll give my final kind of research pitch about working with tribes. I'm just going to say it again, tribes are diverse, and it's really important to recognize that. Tribes are resilient and forward-thinking, and I've already touched upon this. Many people have probably seen, if you're from around this area, seen this map. So these are, it's kind of old, but 2003. But by 2095, the summer for these Great Lakes states, this is kind of where they're going to fall out in their summers, according to some of the climate models. So that's pretty stunning. But, like I mentioned at the beginning, so this is my tribe, this is where we started, and this is where we were removed to, right? We were moved to Kansas and Oklahoma, just where it shows these lake states' summers are going to be. So not only do we have understanding and experience surviving that one time, but we have perspectives that can come into how do we really adapt and become resilient. And then the third kind of thing that I have about working with tribes is that oftentimes you'll hear, again, not everyone says this, but often you'll hear that we are all related, that plants and animals are relatives. And so here's some students, I think that's on the White Mountain Apache Reservation as well, with the Mexican spotted owl. Understanding that, I think at the surface it's pretty easy. Oh yeah, okay, relatives, I get that. But I ask people to really step back and contemplate what that really means. So here are my kids in the canoe. We're talking about our children, our grandparents. I've been interviewed recently a few times around genetic modification of forest, of American chestnut. And this is a point I really want people to understand. Is if you think about your relative, what would you do to your relative, right? It really goes deeply when people say, these are our relatives. Wild rice, where I am in Minnesota, is a sacred relative to the tribes I work with. When biologists hear that, again, it's easy to say, okay, that's a relative, I get it. But really contemplate, what does that mean if you think that that is your cousin or your grandfather? Or your children. That changes our perspective, but it does take time. And I don't think I'm completely there yet either. I need to step back and really understand what this means. And I think we all do. We're all learning as we move forward what this really means. All right, now this is part of the research that I've done. I did a project where we interviewed Forest Service tribal liaisons. We just simply asked them, how do you approach building partnerships with tribes? What works? What doesn't work? What are your suggestions for other people? So this is based on that research. The first thing that typically comes up, especially with federal employees, is that we have formal agreements with tribes. We'll write memorandums of understanding. We have government-to-government consultation. That's a formal process that we're engaged in. And that's really important. One of our interview participants said that formal consultation is an ongoing dialogue that's continuous, that builds a relationship. So even that quote suggests that there's more to it than just having a document or just doing consultation. The second partnership building strategy that comes up is kind of the inverse of that formal relationship. It's forming these informal relationships with people. Right? Understanding, getting to know each other. This is our Forest Service group at the InterTribal Timber Council last year. Actually, they're holding it now this week down in Florida. One of the quotes from our interview participants said, "I consider most of these folks I've worked with for many years as family." That's the tribal people. So they're not just people I work with, they're friends. That's extremely important for building those partnerships. How do you do this? Things like going to the tribal college and giving a talk. They're always looking for people to give talks. You get into the community in a whole different way from the sort of the formal government side if you go to the tribal college and give a talk. Going to powwows. These communities will have community powwows very frequently. Showing up if someone asks you to go and have dinner. that kind of thing. Food is extremely important. It's forming that relationship to know that it's not, oh, it's 4:30, I gotta go home now, because that's what my job says. It's forming those personal relationships. The third strategy, and there's 5 of these, is respect, listening, and building trust. So one person told us, I think it's all of our responsibility to listen once in a while and not just talk at people. Collaboration all has to be built on trust. Listening, again, with the relative thing, it might not even be just being quiet and listening, it's processing, trying to really understand. And knowing that, like in our tribal communities, we have stories that change meaning, or you get to different meaning, levels of meaning, depending on sort of your knowledge of where you are in your life. And I think that's true here with listening. So it's listening, respecting people. I do a lot of climate change planning with tribes, and I think inevitably in any meeting or workshop that I do on climate change, I will get somebody saying, well, we're polluting the atmosphere. We have the ozone hole. We have, then they'll start talking about the garbage that's being thrown down, off the side of the highway. And they'll talk about children not going out in the woods as much as they used to. And if you're a climate scientist, it's kind of like, what are you talking about? That seems kind of crazy to me. I'm talking about carbon and greenhouse gases, and your ozone's different. Garbage dumped on the side of the road is different. But if you really take the time to listen and process what they're saying, they understand that. They're saying that our relationship is broken, and that these are symptoms of a problem that goes far beyond greenhouse gas, parts per million or things that we're measuring, right? And if you don't listen and don't have that respect when you talk to people, there's no way you'll understand that, right? So listening, and doing that listening really starts to build trust. Another strategy, and this some of you in here are leaders of your institutions, others like myself are not, but really having leadership say that tribal partnerships are important is extremely valuable. So it can't just be your own personal relationship, it can't just be a formal document. Leaders really make it happen. This is a bad picture, but this is a previous chief of the Forest Service giving a blanket to the College of Menominee Nation, or receiving one from them. So we had the chief of the Forest Service shows up on the Menominee Reservation. That signals to every single employee in the agency and beyond, this is important. We will make partnerships with tribes and we value it for our land management mission. If you don't have the engaged leaders, it's really hard. You can do it, you can form those personal relationships, but those engaged leaders really help it. And then finally, I think a lot of us, I was getting excited seeing all the cool slides today about going out and actually doing something, right? Going to the field. So this is a strategy is actually doing something. Again, tribes aren't moving, invasive species are coming in, climate change is happening. They want to actually do something, and this hurts me as a kind of a planner, not just write plans. Right? They want to do something. So here we are out in the woods collecting ash trees, learning from some of the Akwesasne elders who have been collecting ash for longer than anyone else. So they have really good scientific knowledge about how to collect seeds, how to process these ash seeds, how to grow them in greenhouses, how to plant them out. They were doing it because their community requested that of them. We would like more ash trees, we're getting older, we don't have as many, and we'd like more. So they started, at this point, probably 35, maybe even, let's just say 35 years ago, doing all this ash work before we had that ash board. Doing projects together. And if you think about it, that helps form the relationships, right? Those personal relationships. If you're out in the woods, oftentimes we hear, let's just walk the woods together. Then you're listening, understanding, building those relationships that really help successful projects and partnerships. So I think this is probably the last quote I have. I want the Forest Service units to see tribes as part of the solution to our land management challenges, part of our Forest Service family. wrap up here, sustainable forestry. So sustainable forestry started in the United States, started with the Menominee, on the Menominee Reservation. All of our tribes are different, as well as diverse internally. And that if we build relationships, really building relationships is key to get traditional ecological knowledge infused into management. There's no other way to do it. I'll stop here for 1 second and say, I think people might know Clint Carroll. He has an Ethno Botany, a book of the Cherokee, his own nation. If you haven't read it, it's great. He's at the University in Boulder, Colorado Boulder. He describes traditional ecological knowledge in a really interesting way. He has a pyramid. And at the bottom is a breadth of knowledge, right? So I always use the example of strawberry. We all know strawberries are good, they're nutritious. We know kind of where they grow, how they grow. That's commonly held knowledge. Tribes know that as well. You go up a little on the pyramid and some people know that you can make tea out of the leaves. Well, that's not hidden knowledge, it's not secret. Most people probably don't make tea out of the leaves, but some of us do. Then you go up another level and it's more specific knowledge related to that plant and culture, and to the finally you have some varied. And maybe certain tribes will have that knowledge, certain groups within the tribe, clans, for example, or families. And then you get to the top of that where you have really sacred knowledge that only 1 or 2 individuals might have, right? We can do a lot with traditional ecological knowledge without having to know that extreme sacred, because it's not ours to know. But we all know that strawberries are good and they like acidic soil, et cetera, right? We can work down here. And if you have tribal communities, when you form that relationship, that's how I see the integration of traditional knowledge. They'll observe something. They'll say, we shouldn't maybe do the timber harvest there, we should do it over here. Okay, let's think about that. Or these ash forests. The tribes are really pretty, I think they were out in front saying, this is going to change the water table. Let's try to think about that. And so that spawns a bunch of science and management experiments that we can actually use in the future. But if we're not listening to that, if we don't have those partnerships, that traditional knowledge, whether we know what's behind it or not, isn't going to help us move forward in the 21st century. So, arguing that tribes are really important for our 21st century management problems. However, this takes time. It's not an easy task. It takes leadership, like I've mentioned. And it takes that deep understanding to really listen and reflect and try to understand what people are saying. And to do that, you have to have the respect. So when I hear someone talk about throwing garbage out the car window on the highway, when I'm giving a climate change talk, I need to really try to respect that person for bringing that up, because they're not doing it because they don't literally think that's causing climate change. But what's behind it is. So. And then finally, finding those common projects, getting out there. So I'm a forester, you all are botanists, getting our hands dirty. That's what people like, that's what tribes like, that's what is really going to help us find common solutions to our problems. With that, this is a website that has all Forest Service research publications for free. Tree Search, if you just type in Tree Search in Google, that's cool. There's, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 articles on there. Essentially, any Forest Service scientist that publishes, we can't give away the copyright, so we house it there. And so, Miigwech, thank you all. I will be transitioning to the University of Minnesota in the fall, so I put my Minnesota email up there. But thank you.